Questions? The first one is, Mike, Muslims believe that Jesus was not crucified and that someone else was crucified instead of him. Where does this idea come from? Does it exist anywhere outside of the Quran? And do any historians support this idea?
Well, so the Quran in, I think it's Surah 4, verses 156, 157, says that they did not crucify Jesus. The Jews did not crucify Jesus. God made it appear that they crucified him, and then he took Jesus to heaven. But they certainly didn't crucify him. So there's debate over what that actually means. When they say crucify him, does it mean that Jesus avoided the cross altogether, that God made it appear that he was crucified, but Jesus avoided the cross altogether, which would mean he made someone else look like Jesus and they crucified that person instead? And then it's like, well, who would that have been? The primary candidate would be Judas, who had betrayed Jesus. And there was a medieval forgery called the Gospel of Barnabas that says that God made Judas look like Jesus, and God took Jesus to heaven, made Judas look like Jesus, and they captured Judas. And Judas is kicking and screaming, saying, "You got the wrong guy. I'm not Jesus, I'm Judas." And, yeah, right, buddy. And they crucified him. But Muslims shouldn't even believe the Gospel of Barnabas. I mean, there's numerous reasons for thinking it's a medieval forgery. But Muslims shouldn't even believe it because it contradicts the Quran. The Quran says there are 7 heavens. The Gospel of Barnabas says there are 9 or 11 heavens. The Quran says that Jesus experienced pain in childbirth. That Mary experienced pain in childbirth. The Gospel of Barnabas says Mary did not experience pain in childbirth. The Quran says Jesus is not the Messiah. The Gospel of Barnabas, the Quran says Jesus was the Messiah. The Gospel of Barnabas says that Jesus is not the Messiah. And what's interesting, it says Jesus is not the Messiah, but it refers to him as Jesus Christ. And Christ is the Greek translation of Messiah. So it's like saying Jesus, the Messiah, is not Messiah. And of course, that's something the real Barnabas wouldn't have done. So there's no reason to believe the Gospel of Barnabas is authentic in that sense. So the other thing is they say, like Ahmadi Muslims will say that Jesus was crucified, but God rescued him from death. He only made Jesus appear to be dead on the cross. They removed him alive, and God healed him and took him to heaven. So Muslims, again, they kind of debate on what's going on here. The way I address Muslims on this issue is I will say a couple of things. Number one is that we can understand why Allah would deceive the Jews who had Jesus killed and why he would deceive the Romans who killed Jesus. But he allowed Jesus' disciples to be deceived as well, to thinking that Jesus died and rose from the dead. And he could have easily corrected that by just having Jesus appear to them, or an angel appeared to say, no, Jesus wasn't crucified, Allah saved him. But he didn't do that. Instead, he allowed the disciples to believe the lie that Jesus was dead and then rose from the dead and then becomes the number one religion in the world and the number one competitor for Islam. Doesn't seem that would be very wise of the all-wise Allah to do such a thing. And another thing is that the Quran refers to Jesus' disciples as Muslims. Again, we can understand why God would allow the Jewish leadership and the Romans to be deceived about Jesus' death, but why Jesus' disciples, whom the Quran refers to as Muslims? And if God allowed those Muslims who were directly followers of a great prophet to be deceived, then how do you know that he's not deceiving you as a Muslim today? You can't. And then thirdly is an argument I call the Islamic catch-22. I can provide several historical arguments to confirm that Jesus predicted his imminent death. Now, there's only 2 options. He either died as predicted or he did not. If he did not die as predicted, then that means Jesus was a false prophet. But the Quran says that Jesus was a great prophet. So in that case, the Quran would be mistaken. The other option is that Jesus died as he predicted, but that would contradict the Quran that says that he didn't. In either sense, the Quran is mistaken pertaining to the death of Jesus. And since they believe that the Quran was dictated from heaven and is therefore divinely inspired in a dictated sense, it cannot have any errors in it of necessity, and therefore the Quran cannot be divinely inspired. So there's a number of reasons to reject the Muslim claim that Jesus survived crucifixion, because there's not a scrap of evidence to support that view other than the Quran, which was written more than 6 centuries after Jesus existed. Now, do I want to trust and put more value in the eyewitnesses and stuff written within just a few decades? Multiple independent sources written by eyewitnesses or rooted in eyewitness testimony within just a few decades? Or do I want to trust a man who at first he believed he was being plagued by demons when having the Quran revealed to him, and then writes down a book 600 years after the death of Jesus? I'm sorry, I'm going with the former.
And this is a good time to give a shout out to your buddy, David Woods, if you want more stuff about Islam and in general. And I think he has a Act 17 webpage, and now he has a new YouTube channel.
He does.
Apologetics Roadshow, I think it is.
Is that what it's called?
I think that's what it's called, after he'd been off of it for a while. But that's you'd give a 2 thumbs up for David?
Absolutely. I'd give 3 thumbs up. David is just an amazing person. He's a psychopath. I mean, really, he is. He's clinically a psychopath. He tried to kill his dad with a hammer, went to prison for it, had a radical conversion experience, led his dad to Christ, led his girlfriend to Christ. He married her. And now he goes on, he's an expert in Islam, but he goes to the early sources like the Sirat Rasulullah, the earliest extant biography of Muhammad, the Ahadith, the traditions about Muhammad, and the Quran. And he talks about what Muslims were claiming about Muhammad in all of this. And he's constantly getting death threats. But, I mean, he's brilliant. I mean, he's a genius. He's way above genius in his IQ. His IQ is above 185. And he turned down the Mensa Society because it was too easy to get into. Serious. And he's hilarious, but he's bold, and he has Muslims threatening his life all the time. One time, a Muslim threatened him on Twitter, "I'm going to kill you, David." And he said, "Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'm speaking at the First Baptist Church in Orlando, Florida on March the 12th. I'll have a lunch break at noon. I'll meet you out in the parking lot. I won't defend myself. You can kill me then. And if you don't show up, then I'm going to tell everybody that you're a coward who won't defend your false prophet." That's the kind of guy David Wood is. He's amazing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and he's very funny as well, yeah.
He's not allowed into Canada, I hear.
Yeah, at least that's what he claims. We need to
He said he was detained at the airport, put back on the plane, and said, "If you ever try to come again, you will be arrested."
We need to bring him here sometime, by the way, actually. So I'm serious. He would be wonderful to have. Here's the next question. Why, in some books of the Bible, do they skip a verse, like Matthew 17:21 and Acts 8:37, or the example I gave last night of, I think it's Mark 15:27 or 28. I can't remember which one.
Well, there's Mark 6. The classic one is Mark 16, verses 9 through 20, where Jesus rose, and it's talking about you can pick up snakes and drink poison. Or there's the story about the woman caught in adultery that Jesus says, "Let he that is without sin cast the first stone." John 7:53 through 8:11. In your Bibles, these and other verses, a few others, you will see brackets around them in modern translations with footnotes that say these verses are not found in the oldest and best manuscripts. And it's true. They were probably added at a later time and do not belong to the originals. I would advise you not to pick up snakes, poisonous snakes, or drink poison. Do not try that at home. Those verses probably were not in the originals. They were probably added to Mark's gospel because Mark's gospel ends at verse 8 of chapter 16. It ends abruptly, and it's like, well, why? What has the ending been lost, or was Mark unable to, due to sickness or imprisonment, unable to and his gospel? Well, we don't know. There's just no reports of it in antiquity. And so it's probably the case that someone in the 2nd century kind of just made up some stuff and added it to Mark's gospel to make it sound okay at the end, so it's not awkward. But I would not drink poison or pick up poisonous snakes if I were you. So I'm happy that these modern translations do include brackets around them or omit certain verses altogether because they do not have good manuscript attesting them. The King James Version included them back in 1611, but back then they only had 8 Greek manuscripts for our New Testament, and the oldest one was still written 1,000 years after the autographs. Today we have about 5,500 Greek manuscripts, plus thousands of other manuscripts in other ancient languages, and we have about a dozen Greek manuscripts that are written within 150 years of the originals. So what we have today is a whole lot more reliable reconstruction of the originals than what we had back in the 14th century when Erasmus put together his, the 16th century when Erasmus put together his critical Greek New Testament that lies behind the King James Version.
Yeah, it helps to reveal, real Christians see truth as their friend because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so there's a concern for Christians to be open to the evidence, to change as the evidence goes. So it shows, to my mind, a matter of integrity as well.
And it doesn't impact any major doctrine. What we have today is no different doctrinal-wise than what they had back then.
Just before I read the next question, those who know me know that I'm technologically incompetent in ways that stun most people. So at least 2 of your questions have been erased, not because I didn't want Mike to answer the questions, but because of my technological incompetence. So if you wondered why I skipped a question, you can pray for healing of my technological incompetence, but I suggest you resubmit the questions and do lots of thumbs up to move them to the top. So my apologies if I erased your question.
And that's why some verses are missing from your digital versions on your Bible.
Yeah, probably, yeah. When my wife married me, she said, George, I knew you were not very handy when I married you, but I didn't realize you were so unhandy as well. So I'm not also very handy with hammers, so. What are your thoughts on the Illuminati or Illuminati or whatever the right way is it?
I don't have any.
No views? Okay, there you go. What are the most credible non-Christian historical accounts / sources supporting the resurrection?
Well, we don't know if we have any non-Christians that mention resurrection. The closest possibility would be Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Section 63. And the version that we have of that text today in the Greek mentions the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus rose and appeared to his disciples. But that was written more than 1,000 years. The earliest copy we have of that was more than 1,000 years after Josephus wrote. And to complicate things more, is that an early church father named Origen in the beginning of the 3rd century said that Josephus was not a Christian. So it's very doubtful that he would be saying Jesus rose from the dead if he wasn't a Christian. So by far, most Josephus scholars today, by far, would say that a Christian from the 2nd or 3rd century added that, doctored up the text of what Josephus wrote. Now, some would say that Josephus never even mentioned Jesus, but the Christian put all that in there to make it sound like Josephus did it. But most Josephus scholars would say, no, that's going too far. Back in the year 2000, I contacted Louis Feldman, who at that time was the foremost Josephus specialist in the world. He's a Jewish, non-Christian specialist of Josephus. He has since died. And I contacted him and I said, you wrote a book in the 1980s talking about where Josephus scholars stand on a number of issues related to what Josephus wrote from, I think it was like 1939 to 1987. And I said, now it's the year 2000. Where do you think Josephus specialists are now related to whether Josephus mentions Jesus? And he said, well, I'd say that at least 3-1 say that he mentions Jesus. And he said, I wouldn't be surprised if it was as much as 5-1. So when you hear some skeptics online saying scholars think that they reject that Josephus mentions Jesus, that's just a lie. It's not at all true. So Christian probably doctored that text. There's another text in Josephus where he mentions how James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Messiah, was stoned. And there's very few scholars who question whether Josephus wrote that. My hunch is that Josephus does mention the resurrection of Jesus there, but he only says that the disciples reported that he was alive. And the reason I take that position is because, and some other scholars do as well, is because Josephus does, the text that we have there does mention the resurrection. And Josephus was born only 4 to 7 years after Jesus was crucified. He was the son of Matthias, who was a popular Jewish priest in Jerusalem. So that places Josephus chronologically and geographically in the very place where Jesus' apostles would have been proclaiming the death and resurrection of Jesus. And if the book of Acts is accurate, it says that many Jewish priests at that time were coming to the Christian faith. If that's true, then and Josephus' father is a Jewish priest who did not embrace Christianity, then it would seem that the discussion about Christianity and who Jesus was would have been a major topic at the Josephus family dinner table. Josephus would have, maybe as a child, would have even heard the apostles preach. Josephus was interested in spiritual things. He became a Pharisee. He became, by his own testimony in his autobiography, he became a Pharisee. He became a Jewish priest. He hated the Romans. He fought against the Romans, was defeated by the Romans, joined the Romans, became the court historian for the Emperor Vespasian. And now he's writing about these things. And so I think he is mentioning that Jesus' disciples reported he was alive, but I can't know that. Anyway, that would be the closest. But certainly what Josephus reports, what Tacitus reports, what Lucian of Samosata reports, it's consistent with the death and resurrection of Jesus, though not directly pointing to it.
Plenty of the younger and others who just record what in fact Christians have always taught. That would be the other type of non-Christian sources.
He reports that the Christians met on the first day of the week, sang hymns and to Christ as to a God, which shows that the early Christians in the beginning of the 2nd century at that point were worshiping Jesus as a deity. But from Paul's writings in the 60s and earlier, we already knew that.
So here's one of the questions. It doesn't have the most votes yet, but it was one that I accidentally deleted. Is it enough of an argument to say Christ appeared to 500 plus witnesses without having testimony or record of such witnesses? Is this a matter of taking Paul at his word and believing by faith?
That's a fair question. As I said, historians look through a window that is often foggy and dirty. We get some clear things. It's like what the historical Jesus scholar who died last year, John Meyer, has said. I heard him say this in a conference several years ago. He said, historians, they do work, it's like playing a game of cards. We always wish we had more cards. We always wish the cards we had were better, but we've got to play the hand we've been dealt. So, yeah, we could ask more questions. We could wish that we had more documentation about who these 500 were to whom Jesus appeared at one time. It'd be nice if we had a letter from Caiaphas, who wrote a letter to the synagogue in Damascus saying, hey, we've got this renegade Pharisee named Saul who has recently become a Christian, and he's out trying to convert the world right now and convert our own, and be on the lookout for him and grab him if you can, because he's preaching Christ as Messiah. He said Jesus appeared to him. I'd love to have something like that. Well, I'd also love to have Plutarch's biography of Augustus. Every classicist would love to have that. I'd love to have the lost lost letters of Paul. I'd love to have the lost 5 volumes of Discourses of the Lord by Papias. I'd love to have the Asinius Palio's histories, Roman histories that he wrote, which Plutarch used. We wish we had those cards, but we got to play the cards, the hand we've been dealt. We've been dealt a really good hand when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. I wish we had more cards that would talk more about some of those things and could say, answer some of those questions. But again, what we have with Paul is this oral tradition that comes very early and goes back to the Jerusalem apostles. We can say they were lying, but then they were all willing to suffer for it. It's unlikely that they were lying. We could say they were hallucinating, but that's got its own problems. So it's like, all right, here's the data we have. What's the best way of explaining it? Resurrection comes out on top.
Yeah, and you mentioned it, I think it was last night, what people don't always realize that it's the constant historical references that the New Testament books are making as well. It fits with it. Mm-hmm. Like if you want to fudge things, you don't mention who the emperor is and who the king is and who the procurator is. You don't mention those types of things. You don't even mention 500 people if you want to hide things.
Yeah.
You keep it as vague and generic as possible.
You don't make women your primary witnesses to the empty tomb because they were lowly regarded back then, right?
Exactly
you don't make statements like none of Jesus' brothers believed in him, like we find in John 7 or in Mark 3 at the end where it says his brothers thought he was beside himself. You don't make up stuff like that if you're wanting to convince people. You only do it if you're willing to report the good, the bad, and the ugly.
And you don't have the disciples all fleeing. You don't have Peter denying Jesus. There's all those things you just don't put in if you are trying to build some type of false case, for it. Next question. You mentioned the autographs a few times, but I'm not sure what they are. This is a great question. Could you give a quick explanation?
So the autographs the scholars also refer to them as the originals. That would the Greek word for that would be called the autographa, and that would just be you'd have the autograph of Mark. If we had the original document written by Mark or Mark's secretary, this is the original right here, and then they made copies of that. So that would be the autographs, but it doesn't it becomes not so clear a question at times because could there have been a second edition of Mark or of John? Maybe the story about the woman caught in adultery wasn't in John's first edition. Maybe John included it in a second edition. I mean, a lot of us authors will have a second edition of our books because we've since found more things that we want to include. So in that case, what is called the autographa, the first edition or the second edition? So that becomes an interesting thing. But yeah, that's what the autograph or the original would be. The original document of that piece of literature. And that applies not only to the biblical literature, but any piece of ancient literature.
So I just want to add to that as the pastor. So he's the apologist, I'm the pastor. The Christian doctrine of inspiration is that it's the words of the final, what we have, it's the words that are inspired, not the people and not the process. So what that means is if somehow or another they found 3 earlier editions of John's gospel, it doesn't mean they're more real, because what's inspired is what God wanted the final words
the message
to be. It's the same reason why in Book of Acts they quote Greek poets. Doesn't mean that all of the Greek poets' writings are inspired. And it also would mean if you found 1 Corinthians, 3 Corinthians, and because I think there were 5 Corinthian letters or something like that, 4 or 5, doesn't mean the other ones are inspired. Because it's not that Paul's the source. It's that ultimately God wanted. I'm just concerned, that's the classic Christian position on it. It's the words that God wanted to have recorded are recorded. And that's also why there can be some differences in the gospel. Anyway, they're into the little thing about it. A well-instructed pastor will know that, but they might not always communicate it to their congregation. I love this one. What would you consider to be the most accurate modern version of the Bible?
Translation. Well,
By the way, most people have the same version of the Bible. I don't know if you knew that. It's called the Dusty version, actually, is the most common version.
Well, I interviewed Dan Wallace on this. It's on our YouTube channel about English translations.
It's very good. You should watch it, everybody.
Yeah. So Dan's like really good at this, and he's involved in translating the New International Version and the New English translation, the Net Bible. So Dan talks about different objectives behind translations. So you've got what he would call formal equivalent. We might say literal translations. And that would be things like the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version. And then you've got dynamic translations. And what they do is they're functional equivalents. So, or they're also called dynamic equivalents. So they're more interested in communicating the message. So, for example, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, in that oral tradition, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, meaning, and I mean, that's used adelphoi there, male Christians. But the NIV, the functional equivalents will say brothers and sisters. Because when they use brothers, then they're referring to both. And I think there's a justification for that. So when Jesus is talking to the Sadducees and they say, hey, a brother's married to this woman and he dies, he dies, but there's no children. So it goes to the next brother and he dies, there's no children through him. And so 7 of them like that, and finally the woman dies. In the resurrection, at the last day, whose wife will she who will have her as wife, since they all had her as wife? And so Jesus answers them. He says, you don't understand the scriptures, because the sons of this world, neither married nor given in marriage. Well, who marries? Males marry, females are given in marriage. The sons of this world, neither married nor given in marriage. So obviously, there are occasions when a male noun like sons is used to mean men and women. So I have no problem with that being translated by, say, the NIV or the New Living Translation or many others that says the sons and daughters of this age marry and are given in marriage. But some people still might say, well, let's just stay with it as literal as possible and just say the sons of this age. So it depends what your preference is. For me, I think I like the New American Standard. That's probably the one I go to more than any others because it's very literal. I read the Greek, so if I'm wanting to check my translation against something, I like the New American Standard Bible. Dan Wallace doesn't really care for that. He says the New American Standard Bible will sometimes the translator will import their eschatological views. Well, all translators will impact that, and the NIV that he loves does that as well. So, then there are paraphrases, and they're fun to read if you're just wanting to really, read but not really pause and ponder over it. You just want a bird's eye view. So for me, I kind of like the literal translations the most, the formal equivalents. But it depends. Most people would probably find the functional equivalents, like the NIV and the Christian Standard Bible. Some of those, they'll find those a lot more helpful.
Yeah, and there's also, they're writing for different reading levels as well. It's that's another thing to bring in. Bruce Watke, sort of the dean of evangelical Old Testament scholars, I think he's been involved in 3 different Bible translation teams. He said that we're blessed nowadays. For the last 50 some odd years, we've been blessed by many, many good translations of the Bible, all of which you can read and will lead you to know that Jesus is your Savior and Lord.
And by the way, none of the English translations are perfect.
No,
none of them are. So it's good to read a few of them.
Yeah. Just personally, I when I preach and when I'm preparing to teach, I use the ESV, but for my private devotions, I use the NIV for just myself personally. How would you go about explaining this to non-Christians, that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are all God, and that God was not the one who died on the cross?
Yeah, well, so what I say to Jehovah's Witnesses when they come to my door and they ask me something like that, well, if Jesus is God, how could he die on the cross? God died on the cross. And I just say, okay, look, I view God when we say God, I think of it like as a unit, a team, you could say. So a team like the hockey team you have here, the Ottawa Senators, is it? I just recently became a hockey fan. So I think hockey's like really a great sport. So it's like you've got all these players, but they make up one team. And there's a coach who's the head of that team. In the same way, I think of the biblical marriage, the way it's described. I'm a complementarian, so I see the husband as being the head of the home. And so there's like a structure in the home. The husband and the wife are equal in their essence, but in function, I think the male has like, he's the head authority in the home. And so the husband and wife, the two become one flesh. Now, obviously, that's not referring to, their bodies being tied together. They become like one unit, but there's still multiple persons, and there's an authority structure. And so that's the way I describe to Jehovah's Witnesses about how you can have three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they make up one unit, God, and there's an authority structure, Father over the Son and Holy. And you say, well, why, if it's like that way, why does there need to be an authority structure if they're thinking the same way? And, well, to that I can give another word picture, and word pictures are, none of them are perfect, right? They're just word pictures. But it's like if I'm walking in a field or something, like let's say I got out of the car and I'm walking in a field and I drop my keys and I'm looking for them and say, oh no, it's down in that hole. Oh no, what's in that hole? If I reach down in there, I'm probably going to get bit by a snake or some kind of critter. I don't want to do that. Now, my hand and my head are, we are one, but they are two separate entities, kind of. And my head is not going to hurt from my hand getting bit. I don't want to stick my hand down there, though. And my head is telling my hand to do it, but the hand, my hand will follow the head. My head is the authority over it. So it's like it's different entities, but it's still one. So it might not be a perfect word picture, but that's the best I can come up with right now.
I just add two things. The first is this wasn't the issue of the Trinity isn't something that was begun theoretically and then imposed on the Bible. It's that when you read the Bible, this doctrine emerges from it and you can't avoid it. That Jesus and the Father they're one, yet that Jesus prays to the Father and they're different, and it emerges. It goes from the bottom up. The final thing is, many of you have not read this. Google it later or now. Google the Athanasian Creed. Athanasian Creed. It's what I call the creed for dummies. Therefore there is one Father, not three fathers, one Son, not three sons. There's not. Not three eternals, but one eternal. It's very interesting to help keep things straight. Athanasian Creed, you can Google it. Why did it take at least 30 years for any gospel to be written?
Well, it seems like when we read Paul's letters, like Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians, he believes Christ is going to return in his lifetime. But by the time you get to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, it seems Paul is coming to the conclusion that Jesus probably is not returning in his lifetime. So the apostles are out preaching word of mouth. People are hearing them. And of course, you'd rather hear an apostle than read, right? A person would rather talk to an author one-on-one than read their book. I know I certainly would. So the apostles are still going around preaching, and very few people can read, only 10% perhaps. And so if they think Christ is coming back in the lifetime of the apostles, there's no reason really to start writing down biographies of Jesus for your future generations. But as the disciples started to die, it's like, oh, and they're realizing, it might be a while before Christ returns. then they said, we better, while the apostles are still alive, we better get some of this stuff down in writing. And I think that's why there was a delay of 30 or more years before you start getting the Gospels written. Now, it's not unusual that 20 to 65 years is compared to other, like I said, with Plutarch's Lives, when he's writing on those really important figures like Caesar and Cicero and Antony and Brutus that led to the fall of the Roman Republic and transition to empire. He's writing those about 140 years later, and they're still regarded as relatively recent. So 20 to 65 years is still pretty good, but that's probably why they waited.
Yeah, and I mean, and I agree with everything you said. The other thing is actually nobody knows. It
Right.
could have been written 5 years after. Like nobody knows. That would be a common type of explanation from it. If you read things, it's very interesting. It's obvious that Paul knew a lot of stuff about the Gospels, including John, using slightly different language to communicate the same types of ideas. But they obviously were coming out of a milieu of a common teaching. But nobody knows. But that's, yeah, World War II memoirs start to get written as people get a bit older.
Yeah.
Not when they're all just fresh back from the war. So
That's true.
given the depth of your presentation, is it appropriate to expose a high school teenager to your presentation? Will it shake their faith? Can you comment on this?
I think it depends where that high school student goes to school. If they're going to a secular university or a public school, they may face these kinds of things. And so, yeah, you may want to expose them to some of this. It's your call. You have to use discretion in this. The way I figure it, yeah, some of this gets technical. Some of this is like, well, is it good to present things in a more simplistic, generalized manner, or is it better to present it with nuances? And this is something we just have to wrestle with. I can't really give you an answer. What I can say is this. 30, 40 years ago, it was much easier to give a more general, simplistic answer without the nuances because the internet wasn't around. Mm-hmm. Today, the internet is around, and you have skeptics that are putting out videos, and they are talking about these things like, well, the Gospels are anonymous. There are contradictions in the Gospels. We should not believe them, and things like that. So it's like, well, we have to address them because our teenagers are watching those videos. And if we don't, I would rather them hear someone like myself explain this, how it is, and why the Gospels in their earliest forms did not have the titles. Because biographies were functionally or formally anonymous. I'd rather them hear my explanation, and then when a skeptic says, hey, they're anonymous, they're thinking, yeah, and? Rather than them hearing it for the first time. Well, you told me they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and now we're finding out that they're anonymous, and their faith gets shaken. So I think even though it may take a little more work, it can be beneficial to expose them to some of these things before they're hit with it by skeptics. We don't have anything to fear. I like putting things in a simple manner, but not too simple. In other words, let's do it as simple as it should be, but not simpler than it should be.
How do history scholars identify biased or sympathetic sources, and how does that factor into their determination of the trustworthiness of a text?
Well, that's rather easy. First of all, they know that everyone's biased. But then you can see statements about their biases. Like, for example, in the Gospel of John, he states his objective of writing so that you will believe. So that becomes very plain. In Luke, in the beginning of Luke, in his prologue, he says his reason is so that he can report the facts so that Theophilus will know the truth of what happened. So people can read that, a historian can read it, know they have a bias in that way. We know that when Tacitus wrote his biography of his father-in-law, Agricola, he's biased because he loved his father-in-law and he believed his father-in-law had been mistreated and falsely executed. We also know that Tacitus had his biases against certain Caesars and emperors, and because the way he reports it. So, just by reading an ancient historian, you're going to notice there's certain biases.
Would a secular archaeologist hide evidence like a letter of Paul if found?
Maybe.
Would a Christian do it?
Maybe. Unfortunately, yeah, I mean, both Christians and non-Christians. What if Paul, we found in a lost letter of Paul, and let's say we could verify that it was written by Paul. And you'd say, well, how would you do that? So you do linguistic analyses and something, and maybe and you do some tests on the papyrus, and it dates back. I don't know. But let's say you are able to conclude that Paul actually wrote that, and Paul makes some kind of a statement in it that says this whole thing was a farce. The reason I did it was for this reason. Well, yeah, you might have a Christian that would hide that. Maybe. You do have these occasional rumors that go, well, the Catholic Church has found stuff that they're hiding. It's like, I don't believe that. It's like, give me some evidence for that. I mean, there's all these conspiracy theories. Everybody has them, and I don't want to base my beliefs on possibilities. I want some hardcore evidence. That's where I'm going to go with.
Yeah, just, and to go along with this, Christian isn't a compliment, and secular isn't a put down. And so whether a person has intellectual honesty and integrity is a human problem and a human issue. I would say that the Bible has transformed the world to make classically there to be a concern for the truth, but we all know that there's Christians who evade truths, and that there's secular people who put Christians to shame with their honesty and integrity. So
we think about what some Christians do, like with the thing with Ravi Zacharias, how the executive committee of the RZIM board hid this stuff from others. In fact, the chairman of the board said, I didn't even open it and read it because it was Ravi. It's like, stick your head in the sand.
yeah.
It's like, really? I mean, that's not what a good Christian does. You got to have integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to live by truth, not by lies. It's a title of a book, but it goes to Solzhenitsyn, but it's a very deeply biblical thing. If Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then our way of living has to be the truth, and including inconvenient truths, changing doctrinal positions and stuff like that as well. Maybe we're getting close to the end. I think we advertised this as 12:30, and some people are slipping out, and you folks are still laboring on, so we'll keep go. What are your thoughts on the book of Enoch and the book of Jasher? I don't know if that's a misspelt or if that's a...
No, that's right.
That's okay. They were referred to in the Bible, yet not included in the canon.
Yep.
Are there any of the apocryphal texts that you would consider reliable and worth knowing?
Apocryphal, well, I mean, like the apocryphal or deuterocanonical literature between the two testaments, they're valuable to read for historical purposes, just like the apostolic fathers are. The book of Jasher was probably somewhat poetic. It is mentioned in the Old Testament a few times. We've lost it. So, I mean, can't really say much about something we've lost. The book of Enoch, known as First Enoch, was probably composed sometime in the 1st century BC and then added to in the latter part of the 1st century AD. It is quoted by Jude. I think it's Jude 9, mentions Enoch. And it reads a lot, First Enoch reads a lot like Revelation, which tells us Revelation belonged to an apocalyptic genre of that time and could assist us in interpreting it. So I'd say Enoch is valuable to read. Why it was not ended up included in the canon, I don't know. I've read through it once. I've read portions of it a few times, but I'm not an expert on it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, for those of you who have the vocation or the calling, read widely. Read people that don't agree with you. Read old books. Read new books. Read widely. Don't be afraid of the truth, and don't be afraid of seeing things that come from different perspectives. When I used to tell my kids when they were young Bible stories, and I would tell them, stories I made up or other things, but I always say to them, this is from the Bible, and I would make it clear that that's a different type of thing that I'm now reading when I would tell it to them. And so for us as Christians, we should read the Bible as God's word written, but we should read widely for other stuff.
When it comes to biases, and everybody's biased, when I read other scholars, most scholars, they don't even recognize they're biased.
Yeah.
Or if they do nothing to try to minimize that. They just have their own agendas. And I'm talking not only atheists or skeptical scholars, but also Christian scholars. What I think is beneficial when you actually take the time and you say, I'm going to seek and follow truth no matter where it leads. Right. And when you're committed to truth, and then you arrive at, and you really take pains to minimize your bias and honestly seek truth, when you come to the end of that journey, and it's a long journey, and it's a heart-wrenching one at times. It's like I've gone through that for years. I still try to be honest. But when you come through that and you conclude something like Jesus rose from the dead, it's like, man, you just feel so much more confident about your faith because you know that you approached it in a very honest and open-minded manner.
Right. This might be the last. I think this will be our last question, well, unless you just say yes or something to the answer. If it is not normal historical method to include a supernatural hypothesis, rather than accepting we just can't account for the facts with any current hypothesis, was in brackets, why should we do it with the resurrection?
So the majority of historians today will say that you cannot, as a historian, investigate a miracle claim. You're barred from doing it. I've taken issue with that. A number of historians have. In fact, the 2006 theme issue of History and Theory, a number of historians took issue with that. And even the chief editor in that said, we've come to a time when it's a watershed time when historians are now, many are rethinking, and we're having to rethink and say, it's probably appropriate now to consider miracle claims because the reasons for rejecting miracle claims just haven't proven to be correct or really wise. So I'm one of those that are challenging the majority on that. I find their arguments very weak. Chapter 2 of my very large book on the resurrection deals with miracles and historians, and I deal with the objections of present and past philosophers of history and historians to say you cannot investigate miracle claims. One of the chief reasons is they will say a miracle would require God, and the historian has no access to God. And so therefore, a historian has no way of determining whether a miracle has occurred. My response to that is to take an analogy and say, please stop me if I said this last night, that historians or astronomers are aware of a comet that's going to hit the moon. I didn't say this last night?
No.
Okay. So they're aware of a comet who's going to hit the moon on a certain day and time. And so when that day comes, astronomers, they've pointed the Hubble Space Telescope, planetariums in appropriate places on the Earth are focused on the lunar surface, and at the predicted time, the comet slams into the moon. And as the lunar dust settles, they see a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord, and it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, an astronomer would say this, wow, that's an extraordinary event. It seems like that would require God, and I have no natural explanations for it. But as a scientist, I do not possess the tools to be able to verify that God did that. So all I can do as a scientist, I can verify only natural events. Certainly this event occurred, the comet hit the moon, it left this message in Hebrew and in Greek. But I'm just going to have to leave the cause of the event undetermined. That's what a good scientist is going to do. Now here's what a scientist would not do. wow, what an extraordinary event. That seems like that would require God, and I have no natural alternative explanations for it. Unfortunately, as a scientist, I have no tools to be able to suggest, to verify that God did it. So I'm just not even going to be able to verify that the event itself occurred. That would be lunacy. And yet that is precisely the approach that many historians are taking toward miracle claims. For me, I'd say if we have enough evidence to verify that the event occurred, the historian can say the event occurred and just leave the cause of the event undetermined, just like a scientist would do.
Yeah, it's partially actually, it's a sneaking in of naturalism as being somehow the prerequisite to enter the club of historians. And it's a misapplication of the scientific method, where in the scientific method, by definition, you're looking for naturalistic causes, but that doesn't imply that naturalism, the idea that there's no God, that it works in the world, that it doesn't follow. You can use the method without implying the other thing. Anyway, a great answer. One final question at 12:30. Miracles and divine events of today don't seem as dramatic as shown in the Bible. Have the rules of an unchanging God somehow changed?
No, I'd say it would seem that that would be the case in Western society, although there are a number of miracles that happen, even nature miracles that I think happen in our culture today. I could give you a couple of examples. But miracles, just in the day of Jesus, he saw a lot of people that he didn't heal. And why did he heal? Why did he perform miracles? In most cases, it was so that they would see the gospel was correct. And in third world countries where you don't have a lot of things like medicine, or you don't have people that are going around and being able to give evidence for the truth of Christianity and God's existence, God works a lot of times through miracles. My friend Craig Keener has written 2 volumes on miracles, documents a lot of miracles even in modern day. His mother-in-law actually saw a resurrection by a pastor. He has known eyewitnesses to resurrections of Francis Chan.
Resuscitations.
Resuscitations, yes. So people who had been dead, they are raised back to life in the same kind of body. He's seen Francis Chan, who is a pastor in San Francisco. He has said that he has been to a place, over to a tribe, and preaching the gospel for the first time they hear it. And in the middle of preaching, God is like impressing upon him these people in the front row, these kids. I want you to heal them. There were blind kids, deaf kids. I want you to lay your hands on them, pray for them, and heal them. And he's thinking, I've never done anything like this before. It's like, and so he does it. And all of a sudden, the blind see and the deaf hear. And so, I mean, this stuff happens today. There are eyewitnesses who testify to this. And you know, in the book of Acts, you've got at one point, I think it's Peter saying, praying and saying, as the gospel is preached, Lord, we ask that your hand will heal and perform miracles and wonders. And they see, and this stuff is happening today in the 21st century. I think it doesn't happen a lot in our culture nearly as much as because of our unbelief, our embracing of naturalism. And so, you know, in the Gospels it talks about how, and Jesus couldn't perform many miracles in their midst due to their unbelief.
Brothers and sisters, friends, it has been a great Friday evening and Saturday morning. So let's all once again just thank Mike for being with us.